Welcome to the O Horror Podcast. Join me as I take you on a journey of the senses and the mind into the darkness. Sit back, relax, and enjoy today's story. Paranoia. Mr. Halloran Beresford, pleasantly tired after a good day in the office, still almost clean-shaven after 8 hours, his pants still neatly pressed, pleased with himself, particularly for remembering, stepped out of the candy shop with a great box under his arm and started briskly for the corner. There were 20 small-sized grey suits like Mr. Beresford on every New York block, 50 men still clean-shaven and pressed after a day in an air-cooled office, 100 small men, perhaps, pleased with themselves for remembering their wives' birthdays. Mr. Beresford was going to take his wife out to dinner. He decided to see if he could get last-minute tickets to a show and take his wife the candy. It had been an exceptionally good day altogether, and Mr. Beresford walked along swiftly, humming musically to himself. He stopped on the corner, wondering whether he would save more time by taking a bus or trying to catch a taxi in the crowd. It was a long trip downtown, and Mr. Beresford ordinarily enjoyed the quiet half-hour on top of a Fifth Avenue bus, perhaps reading his paper. He disliked the subway intensely, and found the public display and violent exercise necessary to catch a taxi usually more than he was equal to. However, tonight, he had spent a lot of time waiting in line at the candy store to get his wife's favourite chocolates, and if he was going to get home before dinner was on the table, he really had to hurry a little. Mr. Beresford went a few steps into the street, waved a taxi and said, "Taxi!" in a voice that went helplessly into a falsetto and slunk back abashed into the sidewalk while the taxi went by uncomprehending. A man in a light hat stopped next to Mr. Beresford on the sidewalk, and for a minute, in the middle of the crowd, he stared at Mr. Beresford, and Mr. Beresford stared at him, as people sometimes do, without caring particularly what they see. What Mr. Beresford saw was a thin face under the light hat, a small moustache, a coat collar turned up. Funny-looking guy, Mr. Beresford thought, lightly touching his own clean-shaven lip. Perhaps the man thought Mr. Beresford's almost unconscious gesture was offensive. At any rate, he frowned and looked Mr. Beresford up and down before he turned away. Ugly customer, Mr. Beresford thought. The Fifth Avenue bus Mr. Beresford usually took came slipping up to the corner. Mr. Beresford, pleased not to worry about a taxi, started for the stop. He had reached out his hand to take the rail inside the bus stall when he was roughly elbowed aside and the ugly customer in the light hat shoved on ahead of him. He muttered and started to follow, but the bus door closed on the packed crowd inside, and the last thing Mr. Beresford saw when the bus went off down the street was the man in the light hat grinning at him from inside the door. "There's a dirty trick," Mr. Beresford told himself, settling his shoulders irritably in his coat. Still under the influence of his annoyance, he ran a few steps out into the street and waved again at a taxi, not trusting his voice, and was almost run down by a delivery truck. As Mr. Beresford skidded back to the sidewalk, the truck driver leaned out and yelled something unrecognisable at Mr. Beresford, and when he saw the people around him on the corner laughing, he decided to start walking downtown. In 2 blocks he'd reached another bus stop, a good corner for taxis and a subway station. Much as Mr. Beresford disliked the subway, he might still have to take it to get home in any sort of time. Walking downtown, his candy box under his arm, his grey suit almost unaffected by the crush in the corner, he decided to swallow his annoyance and remember that it was his wife's birthday. He began to hum again as he walked. He watched the people as he walked along, his perspective sharpened by being a man who had just succeeded in forgetting an annoyance. Surely the girl in the very high-heeled shoes coming toward him with a frown on her face was not so able to put herself above petty trifles, or maybe she was frowning because of the shoes. The old lady and a man looking at the shop windows were quarrelling. The funny-looking guy in the light hat coming quickly through the crowd through as someone hated the funny-looking guy in the hat. Mr. Beresford turned clean around in the walking line of people and watched the man in the light hat turn abruptly and start walking downtown about 10 feet back of Mr. Beresford. What do you know about that? Mr. Beresford marvelled and began to walk in a little more quickly. Probably got off the bus for some reason, wrong bus maybe. Then why would he start walking uptown instead of catching another bus where he was? Mr. Beresford shrugged and passed two girls walking together and talking both at once. Halfway from the corner he wanted, Mr. Beresford realised with a sort of sick shock that the man in the light hat was at his elbow, walking steadily along next to him. Mr. Beresford turned his head the other way and slowed his step. The other man slowed as well without looking at Mr. Beresford. Nonsense, Mr. Beresford thought, without troubling to work it out any further than that. He settled his candy box firmly under his arm and cut abruptly across the uptown line of people and into a shop, a souvenir and notions shop, he realised as he came in the door. There were a few people inside, a woman and a girl, a sailor, and Mr. Beresford retired to the far end of the counter and began to fuss with an elaborate cigarette box on which was written "Souvenir of New York City," with the Trilon and the perisphere painted beneath. "Isn't this cute?" the mother said to the little girl, and they both began to laugh enormously over the matchbox holder made in the form of a toilet. The matches were going into the bowl, and on the cover, Mr. Beresford could see, were Trilon and perisphere, with "Souvenir of New York City" written above. The man in the light hat came into the shop, and Mr. Beresford turned his back and busied himself picking up one thing after another from the counter. With his half mind, he was trying to find something that did not say "Souvenir of New York City," and with the other half of his mind, he was wondering about the man in the light hat. The question of what the man in the light hat wanted was immediately subordinate to the question of whom he wanted. If his light-hatted designs were against Mr. Beresford, they must be nefarious, else why had he not announced them before now? The thought of accosting the man and demanding his purpose crossed Mr. Beresford's mind fleetingly, and was succeeded, as always, in an equivocal situation by Mr. Beresford's vivid recollection of his own small size and innate cautiousness. Best, Mr. Beresford decided, to avoid this man. He walked steadily toward the doorway of the shop, intending to pass the man in the light hat and go out and catch his bus home. He had not quite reached the man in the light hat when the shop's clerk came round the end of the counter and met Mr. Beresford with a genial smile and a vehement, "See anything you like, mister?" "Not tonight, thanks," he said, moving left to avoid the clerk, but the clerk moved likewise and said, "Got some nice things you didn't look at." "No thanks," Mr. Beresford said, trying to make his tenor voice firm. "Take a look," the clerk insisted. This was unusually persistent, even for such a clerk. Mr. Beresford looked up and saw the man in the light hat on his right, bearing down on him. Over the shoulder of the two men he could see that the shop was empty, the street looked very far away, the people passing in either direction looked smaller and smaller. He realised that he was being forced to step backward as the two men advanced on him. "Easy does it," the man in the light hat said to the clerk. They continued to move forward slowly. "See here now," Mr. Beresford said, with the ineffectuality of the ordinary man caught in such a crisis. He still clutched his box of candy under his arm. "See here," he said, feeling the solid weight of the wall behind him. "Ready?" the man in the light hat said. The two men tensed, and Mr. Beresford, with a wild yell, broke between them and ran for the door. He heard a sound more like a snarl than anything else behind him, and the feet coming after him. "I'm safe on the street," he thought, as he went through the door and into the line of people. "As long as there are lots of people, they can't do anything to me." He looked back, walking downtown between a fat woman with many packages and a girl and a boy leaning on each other's shoulders, and he saw the clerk standing in the doorway of the shop, looking after him. The man in the light hat was not in sight. Mr. Beresford shifted the box of candy so that his right arm was free and thought, perfectly silly. It's still broad daylight. How they ever hoped to get away with it. The man in the light hat was on the corner ahead, waiting. Mr. Beresford hesitated in his walk and then thought, it's preposterous, all these people watching. He walked boldly down the street. The man in the light hat was not even watching him, but was leaning calmly against a building, lighting a cigarette. Mr. Beresford reached the corner, darted quickly into the street and yelled boisterously, "Taxi!" in a great voice he had never suspected he possessed until now. A taxi stopped, as though not daring to disregard that great shout, and Mr. Beresford moved gracefully towards it. His hand was on the door handle when another hand crossed over his, and Mr. Beresford was aware of the light hat brushing his cheek. "Come on, if you're coming," the taxi driver said. The door was open, and Mr. Beresford, resisting the push that urged him into the taxi, slipped his hand out from over the underhand and reached back to the sidewalk. A crosstown bus had stopped on the corner, and Mr. Beresford, no longer thinking, hurried onto it, dropped the nickel in the coin register and went to the back of the bus and sat down. The man in the light hat sat a little ahead between Mr. Beresford and the door. He put his box of candy on his lap and tried to think. Obviously, the man in the light hat was not carrying a grudge all this time about Mr. Beresford's almost unconscious gesture towards his moustache, unless he was peculiarly sensitive. In any case, there was also the clerk in the souvenir shop. He realised suddenly that the clerk in the souvenir shop was a very odd circumstance indeed. Mr. Beresford set the clerk aside to think about later and went back to the man in the light hat. If it was not the insult to the moustache, what was it? And then another thought caught Mr. Beresford's breathless. How long, then, had the man in the light hat been following him? He thought back along the day. He had left his office with a group of people, all talking cheerfully, all reminding Mr. Beresford that it was his wife's birthday. They had escorted him to the candy shop and left him there. He had been in his office all day except for lunch with 3 fellows in the office. Mr. Beresford's mind leaped suddenly from the lunch to his first sight of the man in the light hat at the bus stop. It seemed that the man in the light hat had been trying to push him onto the bus and into the crowd, instead of pushing in ahead. In that case, once he was on the bus, Mr. Beresford looked around. In the bus he was riding on now, there were only 5 people left. One was the driver, one was himself, one the man in the light hat, sitting slightly ahead of Mr. Beresford. The 2 others were an old lady with a shopping bag, and a man who looked as though he might be a foreigner. Foreigner, Mr. Beresford thought, while he looked at the man. Foreigner. Foreign plot. Spies. Better not rely on any foreigner, Mr. Beresford thought. The bus was going swiftly along between high, dark buildings. He looked out the window, decided that they were in a factory district, remembered that they had been going east, and decided to wait until they got to one of the lighted, busy sections before he tried to get off. Peering off into the growing darkness, he noticed an odd thing. There had been someone standing on the corner beside a sign saying bus stop, and the bus had not stopped, even though the dim figure waved its arms. Surprised, Mr. Beresford glanced up at the street sign, noticed that it said East 31 Street. At the same moment, he reached for the cord to signal the driver that he wanted to get off. As soon as he stood up and went down the aisle, the foreign-looking man rose and also went to the door beside the driver. "Getting off," the foreign man said, and the bus slowed. Mr. Beresford pressed forward, and somehow the old lady's shopping bag got in his way and spilled, sending small items of set blocks, a package of paper clips, spilling in all directions. I'm sorry," Mr. Beresford said desperately, as the bus doors opened. He began to move forward, and the old lady caught his arm and said, "Don't bother if you're in a hurry, I can get them, dear." He tried to shake her off, and she said, "This is your stop, don't worry, it's perfectly all right." A coil of red ribbon was caught around Mr. Beresford's shoe. The old lady said, "It was clumsy of me leaving my bag right in the aisle." As Mr. Beresford broke free from her, the doors closed and the bus started. Resigned, Mr. Beresford got down on one knee in the swaying bus and began to pick up paper clips, blocks, a box of letter paper that had opened and spilled sheets of envelopes all over the floor. "I'm so sorry," the old lady said sweetly. "It was my fault too." Over his shoulder, Mr. Beresford saw the man in the light hat sitting comfortably. He was smoking, and his head was thrown back and his eyes were shut. He gathered together the old lady's possessions as well as he could, then made his way towards the stand by the driver. "Getting off," he said. "Can't stop in the middle of the block," the driver said, not turning his head. "The next stop, then," Mr. Beresford said. The bus moved rapidly on. Mr. Beresford, bending down to see the streets out the front window, saw a sign saying "bus stop." "Here," he said. "What?" the driver said, going past. "Listen, I want to get off." "It's okay with me." "Next stop." "But you just passed one," Mr. Beresford said. "No one's waiting there," the driver said. "Anyway, you didn't tell me in time." Mr. Beresford waited. After a minute, he saw another bus stop and said, "Okay." The bus didn't stop, but went past the sign without slowing down. "Report me," the driver said. "Listen now," Mr. Beresford said, and the driver turned one eye up at him. He seemed to be amused. "Report me," the driver said. "My number's right here on this card." "If you don't stop at the next stop," Mr. Beresford said, "I shall smash the glass in the door and shout for help." "With what?" the driver said. "That box of candy?" "How do you know it's—" Mr. Beresford said before he realised that if he got into the conversation, he would miss the next bus stop. It had not occurred to him that he could get off anywhere except at a bus stop. He saw lights ahead, and at the same time the bus slowed down, and Mr. Beresford, looking quickly back, saw the man in the light hat stretch and get up. The bus pulled to a stop in front of a bus stand. There were a group of stores. "Okay," the bus driver said to Mr. Beresford. "You were so anxious to get off." The man in the light hat got off at the rear door. Mr. Beresford, standing in the open front door, hesitated and said, "Guess I'll stay for a while." "Last stop," the bus driver said. "Everyone off." He looked sardonically up at Mr. Beresford. "Report me if you want to," he said. "My number's right on the card here." Mr. Beresford got off and went directly up to the man in the light hat, standing on the sidewalk. "This is perfectly ridiculous," he said emphatically. "I don't understand any of it, and I want you to know the first policeman that I see..." He stopped when he realised that the man in the light hat was looking not at him, but bored and fixedly over his shoulder. Mr. Beresford turned and saw a policeman standing on the corner. "Just you wait," he said to the man in the light hat, and started for the policeman. Halfway to the policeman, he began to wonder again. What did he have to report? A bus driver who wouldn't stop when directed to, a clerk in a souvenir shop who cornered customers, a mysterious man in a light hat, and why? Mr. Beresford realised that there was nothing he could tell the policeman. He looked over his shoulder and saw the man in the light hat watching him. Then Mr. Beresford bolted suddenly down a subway entrance. He had a nickel in his hand by the time he had reached the bottom of the steps, and he went right through the turnstile. To the left was downtown, and he ran that way. He was figuring as he ran, "He'll think that I'm very stupid if I head downtown. If I'm smarter than that, I'd go uptown. If I'm really smart, I'd go downtown. Does he think I'm middling smart or very smart?" The man in the light hat reached the downtown platform only a few seconds after Mr. Beresford sauntered down the platform, his hands in his pockets. Mr. Beresford sat down on the bench listlessly. It's no good. It's no good at all. He knows just how smart I am. The train came blasting into the station. Mr. Beresford ran into one car and saw the light hat disappear into the next car. Just as the doors were closing, he dived, caught the door, and would have been out except for a girl who seized his arm and shouted, "Harry, where in God's are you going?" The door was held halfway open by Mr. Beresford's body, his arm left inside with the girl, who seemed to be holding it with all her strength. "Isn't this a fine thing?" she said to the people in the car. "He sure doesn't want to see his old friends." A few people laughed, most of them were watching. "Hang on to him, sister," someone said. The girl laughed and tugged on Mr. Beresford's arm. "He's going to get away," she said laughingly to the people in the car. And a big man stepped up to her with a grin and said, "If you gotta have him that bad, we'll bring him in for you." Mr. Beresford felt the grasp on his arm suddenly turn into an irresistible force that drew him through the doors, and they closed behind him. Everyone in the car was laughing at him now, and the big man said, "That ain't no way to treat a lady, chum." Mr. Beresford looked around for the girl, but she had melted into the crowd somewhere, and the train was moving. After a minute, the people in the car stopped looking at him and Mr. Beresford smoothed his coat and found that his box of candy was still intact. The subway train was going downtown. Mr. Beresford, who was now racking his brains for detective tricks, for mystery story dodges, thought that one seemed foolproof. He stayed docilely on the train as it went downtown and got a seat at 23rd Street. At 14th, he got off, the light hat following, and went up the stairs and into the street. As he had expected, the large department store ahead of him advertised, "Open till tonight," and the doors swung wide, back and forth, with people going constantly in and out. He went in. The store bewildered him at first. Counters stretching away in all directions, the lights so much brighter than anywhere else, the voices clamouring. Mr. Beresford moved slowly along beside a counter. It was stockings first, thin and tan and black and gauzy, and then it was handbags, piles on sale, neat solitary ones in the cases, and then it was medical supplies, with huge, almost human figures wearing obscene trusses, standing right there on the counter, and people coming embarrassedly to buy. Mr. Beresford turned the corner and came to a counter of odds and ends. Scarves too cheap to be at the scarf counter, postcards, a bin marked any item 25 cents. Dark glasses, uncomfortably. Mr. Beresford bought a pair of dark glasses and put them on. He went out of the store at the entrance, far away from the one he had come in. He could have chosen any of the 8 or 9 entrances, but this one seemed complicated enough. There was no sign of the light hat. No one tried to hinder Mr. Beresford as he stepped into the taxi stand, and although he debated taking the second or third car, he finally took the one in front and gave his home address. He reached his apartment building without mishap and stole cautiously out of the taxi and into the lobby. There was no light hat, no odd person watching for Mr. Beresford. In the elevator alone, with no one to see which floor button he pressed, he took a long breath and began to wonder if he had dreamed his wild trip home. He rang his apartment bell and waited. Then his wife came to the door, and Mr. Beresford, suddenly tired out, went into his home. "You're terribly late, darling," his wife said affectionately, and then, "But what's the matter?" He looked at her. He was wearing a blue dress, and that meant she knew it was her birthday and expected him to take her out. He handed her the box of candy limply, and she took it, hardly noticing that in her anxiety over him. "What on earth has happened?" she asked. "Darling, come in and sit down. You look terrible." He let her lead him into the living room, into his own chair, where it was comfortable and he'd lay back. "Is there something wrong?" she asked anxiously, fussing over him, loosening his tie, smoothing his hair. "Are you sick? Were you in an accident? What has happened?" He realised that he seemed more tired than he really was, and was glorying all his attention. He sighed deeply and said, Nothing. I'll tell you in a minute." "Wait, I'll get you a drink." He put his head back against the soft chair as she went out, closing the door behind her. Never knew that the door had a key. His mind registered dimly as he heard it turn. Then he was on his feet, with his head against the door, listening to her at the telephone in the hall. She dialed and waited, and then spoke. "Listen," she said. "Listen, he came here after all, and I've got him locked inside." The Haunted Palace. In the greenest of our valleys, by good angels tenanted, once a fair and stately palace, radiant palace, reared its head. In the monarch thought's dominion, it stood there. Never seraph spread a pinion over fabric half so fair. Banners yellow, glorious, golden, on its roof did float and flow. All this, was in the olden time long ago, and every gentle air that dallied in that sweet day along the ramparts plumed and pallid, a winged odour went away. Wanderers in that happy valley through 2 luminous windows saw spirits moving musically to a lute's well-tuned lore. Round about the throne where sitting, Periphogeny, in a statue, his glory well befitting, the ruler of the realm, was seen. And all with pearl and ruby glowing was the fair palace door, through which came flowing, 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 and sparkling evermore, a troop of echoes whose sweet duty was but to sing, in voices of surpassing beauty, to wit and wisdom of their king. But evil things, in robes of sorrow, assailed the monarch's high estate. Let us mourn, for never morrow shall dawn upon him desolate. And round about his home the glory that blushed and bloomed is but a dim remembered story of the time entombed. And travellers now within that valley through the red-litten windows see vast forms that move fantastically to discordant melody, while like a ghastly rapid river through the pale door a hideous throng rush out forever and laugh but smile no more.